humanists of our time. The modern, unbelieving secularists and humanists of our time. They believe that Christianity is the great danger to freedom and good government.
People who reject the very word of God, people who reject the very word of God, people who reject the very word of God.
This is Freethinking 101, brought to you by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. We wish to encourage you to examine your beliefs, to shake out the cobwebs in the recesses of your mind, and think with us about important matters. Our guest today is Pat Inniss, the president of the Rationalist Society, and he will be speaking to us about Christian fundamentalism. Pat, we've all heard a lot about fundamentalism, but what exactly is it, and who are the fundamentalists?
Yeah, we've heard about them, and I guess we've got a sort of a picture of an archetypal fundamentalists in our minds. There's a lot of them that are available to you see through the media, particularly television. It seems like the TV programs of a religious nature are sort of dominated by fundamentalists, but to actually define what a fundamentalist is, I think the fairest way would be to ask a fundamentalist or somebody that's closely involved in mainstream religion. And I did come up with a definition of fundamentalism, and this is by, I guess this person was labeled as a neo-evangelical. He classified fundamentalism as a 20th century movement closely tied to the revivalist tradition of mainstream evangelical Protestantism that militantly opposed modernist theology and the cultural changes associated with it. It's from a guy called Marsden, I think was this theologian's name. And that's a pretty good definition, because you can think of fundamentalism as sort of a reaction to a lot of the changes that go on. Of course, you see that not only in Christian religion, but I guess the most prominent other example is the Islamic fundamentalist movement, which has a lot of the same elements that we find in Christian fundamentalism. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things I guess I could throw in here that characterizes fundamentalism is they look at virtue in a sort of a negative way, I guess you could say. Well, I have another quote here that identifies that addresses that. Mm-hmm. It says, whereas Christ was virtuous because he loved God with his heart and his neighbor as himself, the fundamentalist is virtuous because he does not smoke, dance, or play cards. By raising a scrupulous demur over social mores, the fundamentalist can divert attention from grosser sins: anger, jealousy, hatred, gossip, lust, idleness, malice, backbiting, schism, guile, injustice, and every shade of illicit pride. Fundamentalists defend the gospel, to be sure, but they sometimes act as if the gospel read, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, don't smoke, don't go to the movies, and above all, don't use the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and you will be saved.
Which version do they use? King James?
King James, strictly.
Yeah. It sounds like the definition there is equating the evangelical approach and fundamentalism. I think perhaps there are other non-fundamentalist groups that are also evangelical.
Right. There are a lot of they did really split up. There's fundamentalism. That one of the things that I guess in a lot of people's minds differentiates it from other sects or other religious persuasions is the fact that they are a lot of them are theocratic, shall I say.
Yeah. And
you can trace that back in American history to really I guess the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now there was a sort of a dichotomy there in American religious history between the Puritans on the one hand, who sought to control really all behavior throughout society based on religious beliefs, and the separatists, as exemplified by Roger Williams in Rhode Island, Okay, now he was sort of a Puritan heretic. He had a very open mind toward people of other religious persuasions, and Rhode Island actually became a haven for persecuted people around in North America. Now I'm talking in modern terms. You think of fundamentalists as being more theocratic, but this is really more of a recent development. There are a lot of fundamentalists. I don't want to paint them all with this brush of being theocratic. A lot of fundamentalists aren't theocratic, but the ones you hear most about seem to be always very involved in politics and secular matters.
Yeah, theocratic almost gives me the idea of a cult. And, that may be stretching it a bit, but...
Well, that's, I guess, one of the definitions I read of fundamentalism was it was religious orthodoxy gone cultic. And there are certain cultic aspects to particularly very fundamentalist sects. If you want to study the fringe groups, you find a lot of them have basically the same religious tenets as the mainstream fundamentalist groups, but they do take on some of the trappings of a cult. I guess the primary one among which is to remove their contact with other elements of society, to sort of separate themselves. And to a certain extent, even the mainstream fundamentalist groups do this because they are very strong on restricting a person's access to certain forms of, to certain media, to certain forms of communication. They they strong backers of censorship. You're not supposed to, even mainstream fundamentalist groups very strongly disapproved of attending the movies for a long time.
That'd be a little too liberal. Okay. Could you outline some of the fundamentalist beliefs which might distinguish them from other Christians?
Yeah, they're pretty well defined, the fundamentalist beliefs, and you can trace a very distinct history of the evolution of these beliefs in the North American context here. Back to 1895, there was a conference at Niagara Falls. Now, the fundamentalist movement had been more informal before then, but there came together a conference at Niagara Falls where people that were of this persuasion got together and decided to really sort of formalize what they believed in, to state it in reaction, of course, to a lot of the trends that were developing in the 19th century. And they outlined what they call the fundamentals. There were the virgin birth of Christ, of course, as opposed to all the other virgin births we've heard about in religion.
History, yeah.
And then the belief in redemption, or that Christ paid for man's sins through by his coming to the earth in the form of Christ and being crucified. Then the resurrection. Okay, these are another religious doctrine that is occasionally met with some skepticism, but the resurrection of Christ at Easter, and then the second coming, the return of Christ, and biblical inerrancy. That's a biggie because that covers a wide range of doctrines that are
the written word is infallible, even when it's contradictory.
Well, they explain that by certain belief that certain things in the Bible are said in a poetic sense, and it's just up to man to understand what the meaning is. I mean, if you say that the sunlight rings, in some poem, I think I remember reading that the Bible had a statement, something to the effect that the wind rang or the sunlight rang, and they would say, well, in modern physics terms, that means there is a natural vibration, or So you look for a meaning even in the
quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics. Well, you may have to turn to that if you run out of other things to look to, but that's where they sort of established the foundation of fundamentalist beliefs. Now, it's further elucidated with the publication of a group of works called the Fundamentals. Now, this was a 12-volume paperback anthology, or a series of books that was published between 1910 and 1915, and it was a wide range of authors contributed to these books. but they were edited by Bible teachers and evangelists. And it's financed by a couple of California oil millionaires that really footed the bill to put this thing out. And eventually they put out about 3 million copies in the circulation. Now, this book wasn't really heavy on politics, you know, like you expect nowadays when the way fundamentalism, you know, is in your mind, you think it's going to have a lot of politics. But it wasn't really heavy on politics. But they did really further develop the basic foundations of fundamental philosophy that were laid out at the conference at Niagara Falls in 1895. One of the things, well, I guess one of the most significant things that they really developed was the concept of premillennialism as premillennialism. I'm sorry, as one of the basic tenets of fundamentalism. Now, this is largely derived from the books of Daniel and Revelation. The idea is that Jews will return to Israel, and that the beast and the Antichrist will cause this great tribulation, which is the last 7 years. And the Jews will suffer persecution. Christ will return to the earth with an army of saints to defeat the beast and the Antichrist, the armies of the beast and the Antichrist, and to begin a 1,000-year period of peace and justice. Now, this was actually, I guess, you know, of course, this goes back to Christian tradition. These ideas have been bouncing around. They're based in the book of Daniel and Revelation, but these guys picked it out and decided that this is something very important for Christians to incorporate into their religious belief. And it continues to this day. A lot of fundamentalists, you turn on the television, you can hear them talking about this, and there's a very strong temptation for them to try to relate everyday events to what they see as this, fitting it in with this concept of premillennialism.
Yeah. Are those books still available, that set of books?
Well, I haven't seen any on the library shelves, but any original copies are probably collector's items. They might make for some interesting reading, but they were very much of a seminal influence, really, in the development of the fundamentalist movement.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to compare those books with current writing in the fundamentalist strain and see if there'd been very much change in the past almost century.
Well, there has been some change because for instance, the fundamentalists at the time that the book was written, they didn't have these concepts. They didn't place this premillennialist, that word gives me a lot of problems, concept in the context of current day politics. So now whenever you hear anybody talking about millennialism, they will usually they will cast the Soviet Union in the role of the beast. And they will, you know, put everything in the context of the Cold War politics.
Yeah. So not much longer, right?
Any day now, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. One thing that has been attributed to fundamentalists quite a bit, I think, relates to evolution. And it's become, I think, even today, one of the primary issues. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things, I guess, Darwinism, I suppose, which really got evolution rolling. Darwin's development, or at least explanation, can't think of the precise word I'm trying to think of, but his elucidation, perhaps, of the whole concept of natural selection, and actually providing a believable mechanism by which evolution could proceed, really made evolution the predominantly accepted theory of the origin of the species.
Yeah,
I guess I should.
The descent of man.
Descent of man, actually.
I think is one that gives some people some difficulty.
Right. When Darwinism came along, a lot of people saw that as a very direct challenge to their religious belief, as it obviously was. Although Darwin himself, there's some debate about what his particular religious views were. The fundamentalists want to always cast him as a person who is attacking religion. Darwin didn't seem to intentionally attack religion, and actually he was very held in very high regard by the British religious establishment. But Darwinism was something that was contrary to the religious beliefs at the time, and the rise of Darwinism eventually brought about, you could say, the rise of the fundamentalist movement well, all over the world. The Christian fundamentalist movement did directly undermine, certainly, the concept that God created man, obviously. But it's interesting because as the fundamentalist movement rejected Darwinism, it seemed that at the same time they accepted social Darwinism, which is sort of a illegitimate spin-off of Darwinism. But the social Darwinism part of it seemed to fit very neatly into their philosophy, because as they developed their philosophy, it was very oriented toward laissez-faire capitalism, as it still is. Many of the people who are promoting fundamentalism today are very strong, I guess you could call them right-wingers. They believe in less government control, smaller welfare programs, and all these things are very, very agreeable with the social Darwinist philosophy. Now, you'll hear them condemning Darwinism, and sometimes even condemning social Darwinism. But when you examine the policies, you see that they seem to be very close to the social Darwinists.
Although they don't call it that.
They certainly don't call it that, no.
It sounds like you're saying that there is some relationship between sort of right-wing political orientation and fundamentalism.
That's been the way it's worked out. It's a little hard to explain why that is the case exactly, because at times it seems like the primary constituency of the fundamentalists seems to be the people that would most benefit from a lot of the social programs that the fundamentalists oppose. But this has happened many times where fundamentalists have worked against the interest of the working classes. And sometimes it has been obvious that fundamentalists have been manipulated by those who would would gain something if certain social movements were undermined. The union movement is a good example of that, where John Rockefeller, at one point, if I can find it in my notes, this is a case of Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was sort of an archetypal fundamentalist preacher, very much in the traditionalist vein. He was anti-Catholic, which is another thing we can get into.
I think he was back in the 20s.
Right, in that era. And he opposed Romanism and labor unions. And this came about, I think, well, the opposition to Catholicism was linked to the opposition to labor unions. Catholicism was largely identified with some of the more recent European immigrants into the country, Irish, Italians. These were people that were competing with a lot of Protestants who were always going to be, I guess, the hardcore of the fundamentalists, but competing with these Protestants for jobs, for the jobs in the working class. Billy Sunday actually went around and campaigned among West Virginia coal miners against labor unions. This campaign was financed by John Rockefeller.
So they were being used in a sense.
They were being used, but they were also using the politicians.
I understand also that there are some school issues that are developing partly in this area of evolution and creationism, and some very sharp issues in that area. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the fundamentalists have made creationism, the promotion of creationism, really one of their favorite causes. They they have decided that the teaching of evolution violates their religious freedom, since it's something that they don't buy. Their religion it's contradictory to their religious beliefs. So they have, this is just really one of the issues, but it's probably the most prominent issue, the teaching of creationism in schools. It's been on the political agenda. The fundamentalists have managed to really persuade a number of prominent politicians to support their goal of promoting the teaching of creationism in school, which is really no more than the teaching of their particular religious belief.
And some of the school boards have adopted some of these suggestions that they've made.
Yeah, that's a little unfortunate, but it has happened, yes, in various areas. But the courts have been really quite unanimous in their rulings that creationism is not science. I guess one of the strictest tests is just to ask, well, do real scientists perform work in the field of creationism? And the answer is that there hardly are any scientists there's no real body of legitimate academic knowledge in the field of creationism. There's, no peer review or any of the things that normally go along with established science. So the teaching of creationism has been largely knocked down in the courts, although it keeps being resurrected by various school boards and legislatures around the country.
This somewhat dates back to the Scopes trial, I think. Is that right?
Right, the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial was in, Tennessee?
Right.
And they had actually, it came about because of a law that was passed in Tennessee, which mandated or outlawed the teaching of evolution. Now, the Scopes trial was really sort of, I guess you could say, orchestrated to test this law. What happened, was that William Jennings Bryan, I guess, had been the champion of fundamentalism, particularly of, a particular opponent of the teaching of evolution in the schools, and they took a teacher that sort of volunteered to stand trial. They took him to court, prosecuted him under this Tennessee Act of, I think it was 1925. And of course, it's a very, very famous case, and it was done up in the movie and everything. And Bryan was pretty much defeated, I guess, in the court of public opinion. But of course, it was obvious, really, that this teacher had violated the Tennessee law.
Yeah.
But the evolutionists, the scientists, really sort of carried the day, and that was really the important thing, not whether this teacher was convicted, but what happened to the public opinion. And it was a great opportunity, really, because the trial was obtained such notoriety. People became interested in this issue, and it really set back the fundamentalist movement considerably. That marked sort of a turning point for the fundamentalist movement in the United States, although they did really continue to have some success in promoting creationism.
There's a resurgence these days, and I think there have been some court cases recently. Although I understand the creationists have lost those court cases, one in Alabama, one in, I forget where the other one was, but fairly recent ones too. One other central issue I understand that has great impact in the legislative area would be the abortion thing, and this is, raising a lot of tempers and so on today. And how did the fundamentalists come to their strict anti-choice stand?
Well, I had a hard time figuring that out. It's kind of strange that they would have a view opposing abortion in a sense, because for the fundamentalists, the emphasis is on what's biblical and what isn't. Now, a stance against abortion isn't really biblical. It's hard to find anything in the Bible which really supports a stance against abortion. And if you look at the Jewish tradition, abortion isn't
Right.
really proscribed in the same manner that the modern fundamentalists do. And even the Catholic Church itself did not adopt a strong stance in opposition to abortion, even though abortion has been occurring for hundreds of years. It was only late in the last century that the Catholic Church formalized a policy opposing abortion.
Yeah.
And there was a long tradition of defining the point at which the embryo became
Yeah.
animated, that the soul entered the embryo. And this, of course, the current fundamentalist position is that, as we've all heard over and over again, that human life begins at conception. Now,
Let me interject here that I understand that the anti-abortion position is not just the fundamentalist position. As you mentioned, the Catholics have that position, and there are many people, even in the what would be considered the traditional, normal religious ideas, that are also opposed to abortion, although most of these standard religions, if we can use that term, do uphold the pro-choice position. But it does cut across lots of different views.
well, if you look at if you try to examine why the fundamentalists oppose abortion, it's difficult, but you come up with a couple of things that might lead you to some conclusions about it.
Yeah.
One of them is for some reason, the fundamentalists tend to characterize the whole myth of the whole overpopulation problem as a myth.
Yeah.
And they don't believe, many of them say, don't believe in overpopulation. There's also a very strong tendency for fundamentalists to lean toward a strong male role or male dominance in society.
Patriarchy.
Yes. And this, of course, is something else that would probably incline them not to support freedom of choice.
Yeah.
So, and then there's also, of course, the anti-modernity, anti-technology aspect of fundamentalism. The modern abortion technology has made it more widely available, made it safer.
Yeah.
And this is an innovation that the fundamentalists react against.
Yeah. We're getting in now, I think, to some political areas. We have just a few more minutes. Would you like to say a little bit about the fundamentalists in the area of political power?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. That's, I guess, one of the things that concerns people most is when fundamentalists become involved in religion, and that's where they've gained a lot of their most recent notoriety. But this, again, is something that it comes up from time to time. For a long while, fundamentalists sort of lay dormant. There were very active, politically active fundamentalists. If you go back into the 20s and 30s, I guess one of my favorite characters is Father Coughlin. And we've got a little snippet of video of him in our opening montage, where he's giving a speech. But a lot of fundamentalists really were more of the separatists. They didn't really believe in involvement with politics, and among them was Jerry Falwell. Now, Jerry, way back when said, he didn't believe in getting involved in politics. He said that I would find it impossible to stop preaching the pure saving gospel of Jesus Christ and begin doing anything else, including fighting communism or participating in civil rights reforms. It's hard to believe that Jerry Falwell will say something like that, but he did.
Well, I think we have really just begun to scratch the surface in this. I think much of what you said is illuminating, and I'm sorry we don't have more time to really develop it more. Perhaps we can do this in another session. This is Freethinking 101, and if any of you in our listening audience would care to write to us with questions about this program or any of our other programs, we would be very interested in hearing from you. Our address is the Rationalist Society, Box 2931, St. Louis, Missouri, 63130. And we would be very pleased to hear from any of you. If you have any topics you'd like to suggest to us to discuss, please do so. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Steve. Well, I didn't get a chance to get into the anti-Semitism or the